Awesome. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to have you all here for this for this discussion of net zero planning with the Magic and Metro West subregions. If you want to advance to the next slide. We, in this new Zoom format, is a little different than if we were going to get together in person. So I just want to put out a request to please mute your microphone unless you're speaking. And if you're called on to ask your question, just make sure that that mic is switched on. And you can find that at the bottom of your screen. You can sort of see where the little microphone logo is. Just feel free to click that. That'll turn your mic back on. Use the chat function to ask a question or to engage with us. Really huge thanks to everyone so far who's been engaging using that throughout already. And then we are recording this meeting so that folks that weren't able to join us today are able to catch up on a lot of the information that we're sharing. To prevent recording of yourself during this meeting, you can mute your microphone and turn off the video function so your face won't be shown. And that will prevent you from being included in that recorded element. If you have any questions about that, please don't hesitate to direct message me or Lizzie. We're really excited to answer any questions and help throughout, not just about that, but on anything throughout this meeting and on facilitation. And with that, I will turn it back, or next slide, I think we've got the agenda next. So just as a quick reminder of our agenda and of our time together, we're doing a little bit of a welcome now. We're going to get to hear the basics of 0 to 101, talk about a framework for equitable net zero planning, and then we're going to spend a good chunk of our time together in breakout sessions. We have 3 breakouts that we'll be going through, and then an exit poll and some closing remarks. And I will turn it over to Lizzie to talk a little bit more about the breakout sessions.
Yes, so I see a note in the chat about captioning, and I actually don't know if we do have captioning for this, but that is an excellent question. So Sasha Perotti from our community engagement team here at MAPC is going to help us with tech support throughout the meeting today. So you also should have her phone number on your agenda if you registered in advance. And so I'm gonna maybe see if we can do something about the captioning. So a lot of you did register in advance and you did fill out the survey telling us what breakout group you wanted to be in later. So thank you so much for doing that. The most interest was for our climate smart zoning and permitting breakout group. So we will leave that as the main room. So if you'd like to be in that breakout group, you don't need to do anything. If you would like to be in our net zero building breakout group or our greenhouse gas inventory tool and guide breakout group, I need you to type that in the chat. So you can either type that Sasha, or you can just type it to everyone in the chat. The reason we need to know that is because we have to manually assign everyone to a breakout group. So again, I need folks who want to be in the greenhouse gas inventory breakout group or the net zero buildings breakout group to just type your choice, exactly what Rich just did, into the chat. So you'll have plenty of time to do that, but the earlier the better. So if you could do that in the next 5 or so minutes, we'd really appreciate that. And we'll be breaking out in the agenda.
So you want us to choose which session we want? Is that what you said?
Yeah, because we have to manually assign you. So if you'd like greenhouse gas or net zero, please type that in the chat. And then for the rest of the meeting, we will just be putting folks on mute as a default, but we'll make it so that you can unmute yourselves at different points throughout the workshop to participate. So I can take any other questions about the logistics of that, and then we'll set everyone to mute. All right, thank you. Okay, thank you. See all those coming in with net zero and greenhouse gas. I really appreciate those. Leah, did you have anything else to add for our Zoom best practices?
Nope. If there are best practices that you want to recommend, please let us know. We're all still learning this new tool together, but I think keeping ourselves on mute until we're speaking will be a big help for hearing each other.
Great. So next I am going to hand it over to our Magic and Metro West Regional Collaborative Chairs just to welcome the group. So I'll hand it over to Adam next from Magic.
All right, great. Can you everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm seeing some nods, so that's good. This is Adam Bishano, Director of Planning and Community Development for the town of Sudbury, and I'm also the chair of the Magic Subregion. I just want to thank Lizzie and the team at MAPC for putting together this net zero planning workshop. I see we've got, I think, something like almost 50 people or so in the workshop, which is really great to see. I just want to take a moment and kind of talk about Magic's involvement in climate change, climate resiliency. I got involved in Magic back in 2014 when I was with the town of Boxborough, and the climate change resiliency planning process was just underway. And it took a while, but Heidi Stucker at MAPC and also Barry Keppard really pushed that forward, and with a lot of help from them and a lot of revisions from people in Magic, we were able to put out a climate change resiliency plan in 2018, which has a couple of components. Has a vulnerability assessment, but then kind of very related to this net zero planning workshop, it has a climate change response strategies. And I sort of think this is where that kind of falls into. And then building off of that, back on February 10th, which seems like years ago, but it was only 4 or 5 months ago, we had a transportation and climate forum where we talked about a lot of different things, but one of the hot topics was school bus carbon emissions. And so we had some people come and talk about, what Concord is doing for that different initiative. So, I'd really like to think that Magic is kind of on the forefront of some of this climate resiliency, and including net zero planning. And like I said, it's great to see everybody here, and hopefully we can, I'm looking forward to a lot of the information that's going to come out of this workshop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam. And I'm not sure if Yolanda has joined yet.
I don't think she's been able to join yet, but
okay.
On her behalf, I'll just say that we're really excited. Metro West is really excited to get to partner with Magic to do this webinar and learn together. It's something we had talked about last year when we did our thinking about what sort of needs there were in the Metro West communities, many of which have, for the first time in the past couple years, hired someone on staff to help support this work of the many sustainability committees that have been growing. So we're really excited to do this work together.
Great.
Thank you, Leah. And yeah, I'll hand it over to Meg, is one of our clean energy analysts in the clean energy department. So thanks, Meg.
Lizzie and Leah. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I know myself and the others on the clean energy team are really excited to share some of the new resources that we've been working on that will hopefully help you all as you're either starting out or taking the next steps on your net zero journey. So I am going to go over some background information. Some of this might be repeat for those of you who are experts on net zero, but we wanted to start with a shared understanding of some of the fundamental principles around net zero. And I'll give some guidance on MAPC's framework for action and how you can get started on net zero in your community, and give you a little bit of a sneak peek to some of the resources that we'll dive into later today as well. Great. So across our region, cities and towns have been making bold climate action commitments. Over a third have set a specific target, and over 2/3 have volunteer committees that are entirely dedicated to working on issues of sustainability, clean energy, or climate. So we're really excited to see the progress that our cities and towns have been taking on this. And I think this also is exemplary that there's a lot already underway across the region that you can all learn from as you're starting out. And we'll hear from a couple of communities in both of your subregions in a bit as well. So as this trend has been growing across our region, our clean energy department here at MAPC has been building out services that we can provide our cities and towns to really support on net zero work. So from things like data collection analysis, that if you join the GHG breakout with me, you'll learn a little bit more about how we can help you in that area, to helping develop robust net zero or climate action plans and setting goals. Our team in the Clean Energy Department is here to really support your communities in figuring out what next steps you want to take on climate action. So to support communities in navigating through this process, about, I guess it was 3 years ago now, we developed a framework for action for net zero planning in municipalities. And these stages that we've come up with are informed by best practices that we've seen in communities, both in Massachusetts, but also across the country. And I think one thing that's key to this process that we've put together for communities is that it can be nonlinear. You can start at any point in this process, depending on where you have a lot of momentum in your community. For some folks, that might be starting with setting that goal. For others, gathering the data that you need and figuring out where you're at with your greenhouse gas emissions locally might be a natural starting point to inform what you set that commitment to be and how you go about your planning process in your community. So to provide a little bit more context, I wanted to go into detail on some of the important terminology that surrounds the language that we use for setting these goals and targets in your community. There's a lot of different ways that you can define this goal, but for the purposes of MAPC's net zero work, this definition for net zero is how we've defined our goals. I think it's helpful to think about net zero as kind of a scale, where on one side you're minimizing the amount of emissions that you're releasing into the environment as much as possible, and then on the other side balancing out those emissions with either removal of carbon from the atmosphere or offsets through purchased renewable energy. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the other terms that you might hear in this space, since it can be a little confusing when people are talking about net zero, carbon neutral, 100% renewable energy. So I want to help us all kind of understand the differences between those. So the other common one I just mentioned is carbon neutral, and this can really be used interchangeably with net zero as MAPC has defined it. With carbon neutrality, you're looking community-wide at all of the sectors and trying to reduce those emissions as much as possible, and then net out the remaining emissions that you have in your community as well. The City of Cambridge has narrowed it in a little bit in terms of how they're looking at net zero. So they're really focused on buildings as one of the largest sources of emissions in their community, and have defined net zero as looking at the building sector, how you can get that balance of the scale essentially through reducing emissions as much as possible in those buildings, and sourcing all of the energy from renewable sources, and then offsetting the remainder that is emitted. A little bit more narrow of a definition is that you can also look at this just at the municipal scale. If you're maybe just starting out on net zero, want to see what it would take to get your municipal operations to net zero. So this would be essentially doing that same balancing act, but just looking at the scope of emissions within your municipal operations. And then at probably the smallest scale, you can also think about net zero in the context of a single building. The US Department of Energy defines this as a zero energy building. And this would be when you are reducing consumption on site as much as possible, tightening that building envelope, and supplying all of the energy needs on site through renewable sources of energy. And then the last definition is one that is sort of common in Massachusetts, is this adoption of commitments to 100% renewable energy. And in our team, we see this as kind of going hand in hand with a net zero target. Having a maximum amount of renewable energy supplied to your community is a core strategy to achieving net zero. So this is something that can really complement the work that you might be doing if you set a net zero goal. So the other component of our framework for action is encouraging communities to take a holistic approach to net zero planning in your community. So when we're talking about holistic planning, what we mean by this is ensuring that as you're considering actions, you're taking into consideration a wide array of the co-benefits that might be associated with those. So not just the emissions benefits of doing those actions, but also considering the impacts that it might have on the local economy, public health, and equity. And we'll hear a little bit more from Nicole about how you can really start to center your planning processes on equity as well. So lastly, I will tell you a little bit about our Municipal Net Zero Playbook. So this is a resource that we have been working on to help communities in developing impactful local plans. The first two kind of guiding documents that are a part of our playbook were released in March. And this is our framework for action, which I've just been kind of talking you all through. And then the framework for equity in net zero planning that Nicole will walk you all through as well. Later this spring and also early this summer, we're going to be releasing the more action-oriented chapters of the playbook that you see up here on this slide. But you guys will get to see sort of an early preview today in the breakout sessions with Nicole and Julie, focusing on our net zero buildings and the climate smart permitting and zoning chapters of that playbook. So all of the content that I covered in this section and the resources that we've already released and the ones that will be released in the future live on our net zero webpage on our MAPC website. So definitely encourage you all to explore and learn more about what we're talking about today there. And now I think we're going to turn it over to three of your peers to hear a little bit more from them about how they've been approaching net zero in their communities, and hopefully that will give you some context to how you might get started on this. Joining us today, we have Matt Marshquist from Ashland, who's the chair of their sustainability committee. We have Jillian Wilson-Martin, who's the sustainability coordinator for the town of Natick, and Kate Hanley, who is the sustainability director for the town of Concord. So we have about 3 minutes for each of them to share their thoughts with us. And we are going to start off with Matt. So I'm going to hand things over to Matt, and you can unmute yourself and people should be able to hear you.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll try to move through this quickly. We are at the point where we have a resolution which has been passed by our town meeting, and we have not yet created our plan. So we started on this journey a little over a year ago, and the select board encouraged us to research net zero and whether that was a good thing for our town to pursue. Our committee began looking into that. One of the first things that we found was the MAPC website, which had a great definition and framework, which we used quite a bit. From that, we knew that the first thing that we needed to do was to build support and adopt a resolution and committing the town to an aggressive target. So our initial net zero resolution, we borrowed quite heavily from the language from Natick, actually. And the suggestion for the 2040 date, which we used for our net zero target, actually came from one of the members of our committee. And I was initially one of the people who was a little bit skeptical of that and felt 2050 might be safer. But basically, you know, the more we researched it, that seemed like the right goal because the IPCC report recommends having our emissions by 2030 and achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. And being that Massachusetts is one of the greenest states in the country, and you know, we are kind of a world leader, we felt like we needed to do this sooner so that we can help other towns. Since then, we've been kind of heartened to see other corporate goals mostly, but things like Microsoft has a target to be carbon negative by 2030 and remove its historical emissions by 2050. So we worked to bring this initially to the Springtown meeting, but the select board asked us to spend a little more time and do a little more outreach to people. So we did things like hosting forums. We had articles in the newspaper. We did some profiles of people who had net zero buildings and houses in town. And so we tried to kind of build that story over the 6 months leading up to the fall town meeting. And we kind of told that story, and we also tried to let people know that it's not every house in town becoming net zero, it's the town as a whole becoming net zero. We also used that time to do some more research. So each member of the committee was researching a specific topic, from energy, waste, transportation, industry and business, things like that. And so by the end of it, we had a pretty good understanding of the major levers we could use to reduce emissions. I would say by the time we came to town meeting in our town, it wasn't that controversial. We did have some good support. The audience at town meeting is pretty supportive of these types of things generally. What was kind of great is that at the same time, there was an environmental club at the high school that had formed. So some of them came and spoke on behalf of this resolution, sort of independent of us, which was good. While we were working on this, we've been working with our town manager to hire a sustainability coordinator. And I have to give Michael Herbert a lot of credit because he's been very supportive, and he helped us to basically use some of the funding from our energy aggregation contract and the savings to help fund a full-time sustainability coordinator position. So Frank Nakashian is our sustainability coordinator, and he started at the end of last year, and he's been a great resource, providing technical expertise and helping with grants and providing a better connection to the town government. So I guess I'll close by saying we've been pretty fortunate to follow some other towns that have put together some great resources, and we're really excited about the greenhouse gas inventory tool. We've started working with it. We've been watching a lot of the progress there and been waiting anxiously for the Playbook. So that's been very exciting. And although we don't have our plan finalized yet, it's been great to see just even how the resolution passed. As the town is considering new building projects, the school building that we're working on was actually designed to be net zero, and they incorporated that knowing that we passed that resolution. So that's been a really good outcome of this already. So I think that's all I'll say for now.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I think the work that you guys have been doing in Ashland is a great example of how you can set that commitment, and that can really start to build a lot of momentum towards the other pieces of the process too. So I'll turn it over to Jillian now in Natick. And Jillian, I can advance your slides for you if you just want to let me know when to do that.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so I would echo Matt in that feel super fortunate to be working in a municipality surrounded by other municipalities that are also interested in net zero. And I think the more we can learn from each other and collaborate, the better. I'm excited about being with this group of peers today because I think that a lot of the challenges that we face are very similar and the strategies are very similar. And the more we can show unity in how we're all tackling those, I think the more likely we are to succeed. So I'll just walk through a little bit of our journey. It's not all on the slide, so a little bit of background. I'm the sustainability coordinator for our town. I also live in Natick, and I started working in Natick in 2014 in November of that year. And at that point, Natick's efforts were really very focused on our green communities work. And that was kind of my main charge to begin. But more and more, I could see that residents wanted to participate in what the town was doing. And it wasn't really just managing the town as almost a entity of itself, as a corporation, as the municipality and our buildings, but really helping the whole community succeed as it relates to reducing our impacts on climate change. And there's a group of residents, a grassroots group of volunteers called Renewable Natick, and Meg, if you go to the next slide, they approached me and said that they wanted to pass a resolution. We had a screening of Al Gore's movie, the update version, and in it talks about having your community commit to being 100% green electricity. And we talked about what that meant and what kind of commitment that would be. And the group Renewable Natick
decided they wanted to go farther and they wanted to push for a carbon reduction goal. And we did use a lot of MAPC resources to get there. We took a version of a resolution that I think was passed in Framingham, actually, and we kind of customized it for Natick. And there was a few things in that resolution that I think were nice to have, because it is a non-binding resolution, which means it doesn't necessarily carry tons of teeth in terms of the municipality actually following through on it. But it did set up some actions beyond just adopting a goal that would require some level of follow through. And those were establishing a baseline of community-wide greenhouse gas emissions, developing an action plan, and continuing to update town meeting about what we're working on. Next slide, please. So I'm really excited because we have been working with MAPC and the city of Melrose and the town of Arlington on creating that tool that Matt mentioned. And this is just, I know a lot of people are going to be in the greenhouse gas inventory tool workshop or focus group later, but this is really what we looked at in Natick, like where do our emissions come from? And it's from these 3 sectors. And the tool really gives you a great way of accessing that data, which you need to come up with an inventory for your community. And if you go to the next slide, what we found was that transportation is really a significant contributor to our emissions in Natick, as well as energy use in buildings. And we also discovered that most of our emissions come from residents, even though we have a significant amount of commercial properties in Natick, being, you might know us as the Natick Mall, though we're more than that. And it's having that bigger picture of our emissions. There were some surprises in it. So I've been approached by some communities who didn't think that this was really worth their time because they kind of already knew what their emissions would probably be like. Or at least who was contributing to them. And we were actually a little surprised by where some of the emissions came from. We can go to the next slide. So now we're trying to figure out what to do about those emissions. And the city of Newton has a way of describing the key strategies of their climate action plan in 2 categories. One is using less and one is greening the rest. And I find that to be really helpful as a frame for the kinds of actions that we need to take. And kind of trying to visualize it in this little chart, because on the left is our big pie or circle of all of our emissions, and we want to shrink that and get it smaller. And the purple portion of that emissions pie, if you remember from the previous slide, that's how much of our emissions comes from electricity. And so we want electricity to be a key path for us, electrification, because we know that that's one of the ways that we can transition to a net zero economy and infrastructure. We go to the next slide. So now we're in the planning part. So we're trying to build our plan, and we had intended on doing a lot of community outreach right now and all that good stuff. We had a very robust plan that has not been happening recently because of the pandemic, but we've been doing a lot of thinking about like what are the right strategies or tactics really to support those larger goals around using less and greening the rest. And this is just one frame that we're using for a green the rest type of approach, which is around our aggregation program in Natick. And in Natick, we require our aggregator to supply 10% more renewable energy than what's required by the state. And we have been exploring a path to getting to 100% clean energy for the program by gradually increasing the amount of additional clean energy that we procure through our program, just as the same time as the state is also increasing its amounts. So we're in the middle of this journey. We have the inventory done, so we know what our emissions are, but we don't know everything that we're going to do about it. And that's where I think the playbook and the actions that MAPC is working on will be so helpful. So I've been thrilled to be part of this process and excited to work with all of you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jillian. It's been great to work with you, obviously, on this project and have your feedback as we're working on these resources. So lastly, I'm going to turn it over to Kate in Concord to give us a little bit of background on their climate action planning process.
Great, thanks Meg, and hi everybody. Happy to be here and see so many familiar faces and names. It's nice in this virtual reality to still get to engage with such great colleagues. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about where we are in our climate action journey. We are right now well in the midst of our first climate action and resilience plan. Quick backstory is that I've been in my role since December of 2017, and early the town committed to an 80% greenhouse gas reduction goal by 2050 and created my position in conjunction with that. So that goal was already set when I arrived. And a lot of work has been done, prior to my role being created, driven by committees and residents and the like. Right now we're working on our climate action resilience plan to really put into writing and clear steps how we're gonna move forward and take steps towards achieving our climate action goals in the next 5 years. So we're working on this plan. The scope is both greenhouse gas reduction, so kind of a net zero focus, and also climate resilience. This has been funded by the MVP action grants from the state, and through that funding, we've been able to work with a consultant team. The lead consultant is Kim Lundgren Associates, KLA, who many of you probably know, and they have a couple subcontractors that have been working with us. The timeline for our project really kicked off in September of last year, and per the grant deadlines will be done by June 30th of this year. So if I seem a little blurry-eyed, it's because we are in the final 6 weeks of this planning process. But our plan, where we're at now and that it's almost done, it has ultimately come down to, we've identified 22 priority actions that we need to take as a community in the 5 elements, which are on this slide: built environment, energy, mobility, natural resources, and preparedness. And those actions were selected through a process of evaluating, considering a lot of different actions based on best practices, what actions were already identified in previous town plans. This builds on a lot of other planning and analysis. We did a greenhouse gas inventory in 2017, also a wedge analysis to quantify the potential for some key strategies. We recently completed a long-range plan, which has a strong focus on sustainability and climate resilience. And the important part of this plan is that it features implementation blueprints for each of those priority actions. So step by step of how we're gonna do it, who's gonna do it, when's it gonna happen, what are the financing mechanisms and resources we can take advantage of to get these things done, how are we gonna factor equity into the implementation. And I think for me, it's really exciting because it's a big step in going from ideas, which there are so many of, as many of you know, in climate work and communities. Everybody has an idea, but taking those ideas and saying, these are the priority actions we need to take as a community, and here are the steps that we're gonna do in the next 5 years. So it really helps move into implementation. I wanted to share quickly a couple kind of lessons learned and recommendations, because as I said, now that we're nearing the end of it, I feel like we've learned a lot about going through this process that would probably be helpful for other communities working towards the same goals. One of my recommendations is to definitely start with a greenhouse gas inventory. That's such a key point, as Jillian said, to know where your emissions are coming from. You might be surprised. A lot of towns and cities are similar, but they're not all the same exactly. And so it is really good to know and to have that data to point to and say, like, we know that 30% of our emissions are coming from homes. That's big. We need to do that, address that in a way. Also, I think, for us, integrating resilience to making sure that you have the baseline analysis there. The MAGIC Climate Resilience Report is a huge help there. We also did the MVP planning grant, which I'm sure many of you have gone through. You can do an expanded scope for the planning grant, which we did, to do additional community engagement. But that's a great resource to be able to do any initial analysis and baseline that you need to do before your climate action plan. I would say, considering your stakeholder groups, involving them in scoping the plan We, you know, as I said, our plan is focused on both greenhouse gas reduction and climate resilience. And that has been a challenging topic for some to get on board with, integrating the two. You know, why not just reducing emissions? Why not resilience? Should these be separate plans? And there's a lot of reasons why they're integrated, but having those conversations early on, I would say, would be really helpful, so that when you do get started on your plan, everybody's on board with the scope of it. And in that vein, advisory groups, we have both a community volunteer advisory group and a municipal advisory group. Our volunteer group is one official town committee, which presents a lot of challenges with open meeting law. So I would definitely consider, you know, who your best advisory groups are going to be, and also engage with them ahead of time, because you will be asking for a good amount of their time in this process, so making sure they're on board and prepared for that. I think, you know, drawing on best practices from other communities is a huge help, and I'm really, really excited about MAPC's playbook, because I think that's such a huge value and resource to not reinventing the wheel. And the last thing I would say is just, you know, really considering your community engagement. As Jillian mentioned, community engagement is very difficult in these times. Luckily, we did a lot before the shutdown, but it is a very weird reality to try and be wrapping up a community climate action and resilience plan when you can't actually be in the community meeting in person. So I think that thinking ahead to how you want to do that, who you want to engage, and what you want to engage them on. You know, with climate action planning, some of the questions can be like, what have you seen with climate change, and what do you think we should do? And for a lot of folks, they just don't really have answers to that. So really targeting questions that fit your audience and enable you to get the data points that you need. So I'll stop there, but happy to take questions. I have to hop off to actually get to a meeting about our climate action plan later today.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate, so much for joining. I think we're running just a little bit over on our agenda, so we're probably going to hop right to Nicole and her presentation on the framework for equity. So I'm going to switch my screen share. How do I? All right. Switch my screen share over to her. But I think, Kate, you just highlighted a bunch of the different stages of the planning process, and Nicole is going to talk a little bit about how we've developed some guidance to help make sure that that process at each stage is taking an equitable approach and being really mindful about who we're engaging in the process.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you so much, all of you, for sharing how this is impacting your immediate communities. Like Meg said, the framework for equity is one of the overarching sections of our net zero playbook. And so this, along with the framework for action, provide a lens through which municipalities can work on their net zero plans and targets. So we've seen a lot of different definitions for equity in different contexts, and I think it's helpful to have a working definition when we're thinking of net zero. So this is just one definition, but the important takeaways from this definition are that equity is a practice, so it's ongoing. It's not that we do it once and we get to an endpoint. We have to be continually creating and innovating to be achieving equity. And the second is that equity means that we're responding to existing dynamics. So when we're accomplishing equity, we're actually accomplishing change. And a lot of the time, that change is changing power dynamics. So we have to assess what those dynamics are and then be able to change them in our planning process. So a practice and responding to existing dynamics. So some other terms come up often when we're talking about equity, and it's important to really distinguish what those terms are versus equity. So when we're talking about equity, we're not talking about equality, and it can be really tempting to use one instead of the other. But when we're talking about equality, then we're saying we're going to create the same standards and treat everyone exactly the same. which is nice, but isn't changing that existing dynamic or investigating that dynamic. So there's the difference between equity and equality. We also hear often about diversity and inclusion when we're thinking about equity, and these two are not the same as equity, but they are stepping stones along the way to get to equity. So to achieve equity, we often do need both diversity and inclusion. And we just want to be really clear when we're setting targets, which term we're talking about in which context. So here for net zero, we're using equity as our lens. So let's talk about why we're doing that. One of the first reasons we're using equity as this lens for net zero work, that there's an intersection of possible solutions. So when we're looking to solve urban heat island effect, housing insecurity, and poor indoor air quality, the solution to multiple problems can have an equitable solution as well. So if we're looking for at our buildings and saying, how do we make these net zero outside of the context of equity, we may not be achieving as many solutions as we would if we were thinking about who is living in those buildings, who is benefiting. One of the other reasons we're focusing on equity is because there's a huge cost to not doing anything or not taking any action, because we already see existing inequalities in our region. And this is really coming to the forefront in the current crisis for a lot of us when we're doing our planning work. And this chart gives a good example of where people of color are living and where impervious surfaces are. So we can, through this map, impervious surfaces are in gray, and the population of people of color is in orange and red. And we can see that there's a lot of overlap. So we know that as a proxy, people of color are living in areas where we're also seeing these negative effects of climate change. So it's worthwhile to double our focus. And then the other big reason that we're focused on equity is that throughout our net zero planning framework, we're focusing on the benefits of net zero and how we can maximize those benefits through all of our actions and strategies that we're choosing for each community. So there are a lot of different benefits to each net zero action. We're looking at energy, economic benefits, environmental benefits, public health benefits, and equity benefits. So how do we actually do this? We can implement and center equity into each stage of the planning process. So we want to be not just thinking of equity as an add-on at the end of the project or as something that we're going to do partway through. We want to really be starting at the beginning and thinking through the whole lifetime of our planning project and seeing how we can implement equity into each stage of the process. And it will really deepen our stakeholder engagement, our feedback, the data that we're getting throughout the whole plan. So we start with budgeting and scoping. We want to implement equity into our research, into the questions that we're asking, definitely in our stakeholder engagement, and we want to plan for that. And then in the selection of our actions and in that communication. So what does that look like in the project scope? So in your scope, you want to include an equity assessment, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. You want to really plan for robust community engagement upfront so that you have the budget for that as you go forward in the plan. You want to make sure that you're planning for enough time to process data that you are getting. You want to center lived experiences and qualitative data. You just want to make sure that you have enough time to get that feedback and then assess it so that you're able to include it into the actual plan. And then you want to budget to be able to compensate partner organizations. So you might want to partner with local community organizations to reach groups that you wouldn't otherwise be able to reach directly as a municipality. You want to think about how you would want to use translation and interpretation services. And then you want to make sure that you have enough time to meet with your immediate project team on your equity goals that you're setting. So when we're talking about equity, the other place where we can get a little hazy is who we are actually talking about. It's really important in our stakeholder engagement and throughout our planning process that we're really specific about which groups we're intending to target. And that can change a little bit by different strategies and measures. So some examples of populations to think about are race, immigration status, socioeconomic status, age, gender and sexual orientation, and language. So you want to think about how each of these identities intersect and which groups will be most impacted by the measures that you're trying to implement. I'll talk about that in the equity assessment a little bit more, but the takeaway is you really want to be as specific as possible about who you're talking about, because if you leave it vague, each person in the team will have a different idea of who you're trying to target and you won't be as effective. So your equity assessment is how you can determine with your team how effective you're being towards equity. And this is a good exercise to go through at the beginning of the project as you're doing your stakeholder engagement and as you're selecting your actions. So for each measure that you're going to pick for your plan, you want to think about who has been impacted historically. You also want to think about who would be most impacted by the types of changes in our climate that we're expecting to see. So though if your measure is really focused on urban heat island effect, you want to think about who that most impacts. And then the third piece is to think about who would most benefit by that measure. So who's going to be receiving those co-benefits? If you're working on housing and thinking through for new buildings, what the building envelope looks like, then who's going to be living in those buildings? So you're thinking through at these three stages, what is that impact, and is that impact the equity impact that you want to see? And if not, how can we change that? And then for stakeholder engagement, this is one of the most important parts of the planning project for equity. So you want to make sure that you're reaching groups that you wouldn't normally reach during your planning process. A big way to do that, like I said before, is to engage local community groups that have that trust built already and that direct engagement ability. To get creative and think about a variety of ways to engage in the planning process. We're forced to get creative right now anyway. So some of those solutions may be virtual engagement, different types of surveys, thinking through who can access the computers and technology that would be needed to respond. And then another important piece for all projects is to think about how you're going to tackle some difficult conversations. When we talk about equity, we're often opening the door for a lot of other conversations at our public meetings or in our engagement process. You want to make sure that you and your team are on the same page about what impact you want to be having with each measure and with the planning process. And if comments come up or coded language or microaggression happens, how you want to handle that in the moment. And then a big thing is to ask for feedback on integrating equity into the planning process as part of your stakeholder engagement. So once you get through your stakeholder engagement and have all that great feedback and you're at the section of the plan where you're actually putting that plan together, here are a couple ways that equity comes into play. So in your action prioritization, you want to make sure that you're centering that great feedback that you got from that stakeholder engagement from folks who have been traditionally left out of the planning process to really make sure you're being clear how those decisions are being made. When you go to policy and program development, so some of that implementation, make sure you're referring to that feedback again and thinking again about that impact and who would be most impacted. And then when you're communicating that final deliverable or that plan make sure you're acknowledging the history of that area. So you're referring back to your equity assessment. Use your translation and interpretation services that you budgeted for so that everyone has access to that plan. And then make sure you're partnering again with your equity partners and your local community groups to help get the word out. So here are some examples of net zero plans that have chapters or sections that really focus on equity as well. And so these are some good resources to look at. So we have DC's Clean Energy DC plan as an equitable transformation chapter. In Providence, Rhode Island, they have a climate justice plan, and through their planning process, they also created a racial and environmental justice committee, and they solicited future stories. And so that was a really cool way to get different narratives in that project to be able to incorporate into the plan. And then in Boston, the Carbon Free Boston Plan has a social equity report that pairs with it that looks to those equity impacts and tries to measure those alongside the plan. So these are 3 really cool examples to look at if you're thinking about an equity chapter or incorporating equity throughout that final deliverable. And then,
We're going to skip our poll because we're a little over time. So we are just going to take 1 or 2 questions before we go into breakout groups. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Yeah. I just want to type any questions in the chat. You can do that. If you'd like, there's also a raise your hand function on Zoom. So if you raise your hand, we can unmute you in order for you to ask your question. I think Leah will help us moderate this section.
To raise your hand, you can click on participant, and in the bottom right hand corner there should be a raise hand button, and that will let you raise your hand. If you are calling in, you can click *9 on your pad, on your phone pad, and that will raise your hand for you as well. Any questions from folks about either Nicole's presentation or from our municipal speakers? Quiet bunch today. Give it another 30 seconds in case folks are typing away.
Nicole, maybe I can ask you a question. This is Julie. I'm just curious, where do you start with equity work and climate change? If my community hasn't done this type of engagement before, what are some of the first steps you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question, Julie. I think a good place to start is with those questions from the equity assessment. And those questions are really designed to be able to be done at different scales. So you might not have all of the population data or all of the qualitative data that you'd want to do that assessment. But you can still do an initial quick assessment and then look to get more detail, do some engagement, and really try to hear feedback from the groups that are most impacted. I think we have a raised hand too.
Yep, we have a raised hand from Pamela.
I was just wondering whether you can legally require net zero building in new construction. What legal power do we have to affect building code type things?
It's a great question. Nicole, are you able to tackle that one?
Yeah. Communities can, that is a great question, because there is a line where communities can't enact regulations that are conflicting with the building code, but municipalities have a lot of different opportunities to engage with code, both on the technically international but mostly national scale, and also at the state level. So this past year, in the fall, we heard from a lot of Massachusetts municipalities who were able to actually vote on the national or international energy conservation code. And that voting for that code in particular comes up every 3 years. And then there have been a lot of conversations going on at the state scale at the Board of Building Regulations and Standards. And so we've also been engaging with municipalities and folks who are looking to speak to energy code at that scale too. So municipalities can't directly conflict with the building code in their regulations, but through zoning and other measures, you can still achieve some net zero actions. You just can't be overlapping with what the code covers.
Great, thanks, Nicole. And we have a question in the chat from Matthew. Would you recommend incorporating views from impacted communities that may be outside our geographic area, such as towns that have a higher pollution from energy generation or towns which have been impacted by fracking? I think that one is probably good for Nicole and Meg.
Yeah, I'd say in terms of equity, we would really encourage communities in a region and a sub-region to work together and think about that broader scale. And I would say for net zero as well, it's worth thinking larger than your municipality's borders.
That's a great segue, I think. Yeah, thank you, Leah. Thank you, Nicole. And thanks to those who asked questions. I think that's a great segue into our breakout group. So we have already been pre-sorted. Thank you so much to Sasha. So in just a few seconds, Sasha is going to split us into breakout rooms. This main room will stay as the climate smart zoning and permitting with Nicole. So if you have more questions on that, you can choose to stay in the main room. Otherwise, you'll be sent into a breakout room for either the greenhouse gas inventory with Meg or net zero buildings with Julie. And then if you need any support on your breakout room, just send a individual message to Sasha Parodi and she will help you out. So I think with that, we can break out into our breakout rooms. You'll see a button come up on your screen if you're being invited into greenhouse gas inventory or net zero buildings, and you'll just click that button that's inviting you into the breakout room.
Okay, sounds good. I will share my screen again with the net zero permitting and zoning slides. All right, can everyone see that? Nice. So I'm gonna go through some information on climate smart zoning and permitting, and then we're gonna have plenty of time for questions afterwards. Okay. So climate smart zoning and permitting is one of these longer sections of the playbook that Meg was talking about earlier. And so in this section, we have some top strategies and actions that municipalities can take on zoning and permitting. And there are more things that municipalities can do that are outside of this chapter. But we've really focused on some of the pieces that we think are most impactful and which Massachusetts municipalities and municipalities in our region would be really interested in. So I know we talked about in answering Pamela's question about what municipalities can do for zoning and versus code. But through zoning and permitting, municipalities can really make a big difference in encouraging net zero buildings within the municipality. And one of the biggest ways municipalities can make a difference is by actually taking some of these opportunities for leadership. So we know from enacting other zoning measures, it's a lot easier to adopt zoning language that another municipality has already adopted. It's a little bit easier to make that case. And throughout this chapter, there are many opportunities for municipalities to actually be that first community to adopt some language within the state. And so that's a great way to show leadership and to help encourage other municipalities to adopt that language too. So you can make a really outsized impact by adopting some of these changes. And so the places where those come up in this chapter and in the selection of actions we've curated is in by right zoning, in some of the overlays that I'll talk about, and in a couple different areas. And so there are 4 strategies for this chapter, allowing by right a lot of different technologies that will encourage net zero building, some different climate overlays that you can enact, requiring energy efficiency and clean energy in a couple circumstances, and then ways to streamline permitting for net zero buildings. So we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. So for allowing clean energy by right, there are a couple different ways to frame the actual language to allow by right. But for these actions, we wanted to have some by right language for different technologies. And one way to do that is by coming up with a definition for an open-ended technology so that you won't have to update your zoning language every time something new but beneficial to net zero buildings comes along. And this language should be supported by changing your definition section and really identifying those different technologies and categories of technologies that you want to encourage. And also by looking at your height and setback restrictions and enacting exemptions to those. One of the big places where you can be a leader in climate zoning is by establishing climate overlays. And so one of the big ways to have an impact is also to do these net zero or highly efficient climate overlays. And there are 2 strategies to go about this. You could frame it by a building standard. So if you're going that path, you really want to make sure you're choosing a building standard that's established and that has a lot of different pathways for compliance so that you're avoiding putting a developer in a position where they're having to choose between the zoning and the code, the building code. And the other way to do this is more innovative, and it's by picking an emissions cap for carbon dioxide equivalent emissions and setting those caps for different areas or different zones. So for that, we really want to be looking at what your greenhouse gas inventory is showing you and setting appropriate targets there. So there's some really creative ways to set these overlays. Here's an example of what this overlay can look like in more detailed language. So you can be looking at buildings, transportation, energy source, and open space and landscape. One of the really advanced ways to employ this measure is to deploy car-free zones in certain zones for your overlay. You can look at allowing community shared solar by right. That's for an energy source measure. So there are a lot of different ways that you could formulate this zone in practice to make it a right fit for your community. Let's see. So then the third strategy is to require energy efficiency and clean energy, and this has a lot of diversity within this section. So one strategy is to require eco roofs. And I'll talk about what that looks like. you can adopt a green code. You could encourage existing buildings to use climate mitigation strategies. You can electrify residential and commercial buildings. So an eco roof requirement is a combination of a lot of different technologies. So it's a way to allow for flexibility in the use of roofs, but you're also encouraging a lot of different technologies that have different goals, but are still helping you achieve a better mitigation and adaptation strategies. So you can allow for a different range of uses for the roofs. So this means that you're not just saying every roof needs to have PV for existing structures that might not be feasible on certain sites. You are giving more options. And you can pick which options are a good fit for your community, but this is a good base language to work from and tweak. A green code is a way to encourage green infrastructure. And so you're setting a points-based system and assigning different actions, different points. And then this can often be implemented into the setbacks and use section of your zoning. And there's a great example of this in Somerville now, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But this is the example from Seattle's Green Factor Code. And so for developers coming in and going through this checklist, they would pick the different measures that they're taking, and their green factor would need to add up to a certain score depending where they are. One option in this strategy is rental licensing for energy efficiency. This is another area to really demonstrate leadership. And this is based on action in Boulder, Colorado. So they have smart regs. And this is where rental property owners have to comply with this rental licensing for energy efficiency with either a performance or a prescriptive path that then gets more restrictive as you go. So the performance path is based off of a HERS score. The prescriptive path is based on the points from a checklist. So they actually implemented this pretty early. So it was in 2011 with a deadline of 2018. So we're just seeing some of those buildings and units come in now. And this is a really creative way to achieve energy efficiency on existing buildings and to really help target some of the more vulnerable populations in a community. So I really like this action. And then the last strategy in this chapter is to streamline permitting for net zero buildings. So this can look like making a permitting checklist, thinking about what that process looks like in zoning, in inspectional services, and for the developer coming in, what paperwork are they filling out? And you can even say that net zero buildings would have reduced permitting fees or reduced time to get through the whole permitting flow. But the value of really looking at your permitting process in order to, no matter how you decide to eventually streamline it, is that everyone in your municipality gets on the same page about net zero buildings. So one of the really important ways to implement this is actually to do training for staff on what net zero buildings look like, how to inspect for a net zero building, how to make sure it's both safe in achieving your energy efficiency and net zero targets. So I'll give you two good examples of some creative zoning uses for net zero. So in Watertown, they have a solar zoning requirement. And so this really builds off of the solar ready requirement, which is in part of the building code now, and actually and goes further and requires PV for those structures. And then another example to look at is Somerville's zoning overhaul. And they've included a green factor code in that zoning overhaul and have also looked at a couple of different measures that they've included in that zoning overhaul to help new buildings be closer to net zero and really energy efficient. So I'll open it up for questions. I know that was a lot. And folks can write those into the comment section as well. Or raise
Find a little raised hand thing.
Where would you, the raise hands is under participants. Should be, there's a little dash. Oh, Catherine, love to hear your question. Ooh, 1 minute, Catherine, you're muted. Could you unmute yourself, Catherine? Perfect.
Okay. Catherine Perry at Bedford. I'm the assistant planner. We've just very briefly dipped our toe into the water of this kind of zoning for energy reduction. And what we've come up with is putting a small incentive into our zoning for accessory dwelling units, which was something we were working on. And from my examination of this overlap with the building code rules, I feel more comfortable about putting an incentive in the zoning where you get, in this case, it's a slightly bigger floor area allowance if you meet certain energy requirements. And I've defined it there to mesh with the building code by requiring 5 Hers points better than whatever the current building code is, which also gets around the fact that the building code changes. But I'm still nervous about putting those kinds of requirements into the base zoning, because it does seem to fight with the building code, you know, which really occupies that field.
Yeah, so I think the easier ways to achieve some of the more aggressive measures can be through overlays or through special permitting. And so those can be 2 ways to push a little further. But it is a tricky balance to say what is not conflicting with code and what is. I think you want to make sure, though, that you're giving lots of different options for compliance and that you're finding a lot of different ways to support the changes that you want to see. So sometimes that can be supporting with a definition, giving a guidance document separate from zoning for what does that permitting look like, to make it a little bit faster. But I can't say for sure which exact measures would be in conflict or not. Those are good checks to see, am I mostly on the right track or not. But when we are making new zoning language, especially, there's always a small risk that we're not exactly right with the language.
I saw a hand up from Amy and then Tracy and then Charles. So Amy, did you have do you still have a question? All right, I will switch to Tracy. We'll hear your question next.
Okay, I have a lot, but I'll ask the one. So I really enjoyed the part about equity and all that. So one of my big problems is that in a lot of the low income housing, everything is so compact. And it's when people are just trying to get through their day, it makes it more difficult for them to recycle or care about, you know, in the environment so much. Now, in terms of building, because I'm on the City Framingham's subcommittee for zoning and planning, I like the idea of proposed coding into some of the zoning laws and stuff. And on new buildings coming up, that's great. But say in a lot of places, you have a lot of old buildings. So what can we do to quickly, well, as quickly as possible, get all of our buildings into, you know, how can we speed up that and get them all up to code? You know, that's the question.
That's a great question. And I think that's why my particular favorite is the rental licensing measure, because it can be hard with zoning as a tool to address existing buildings. You bring up a great point as well about limited space already. And I think that's why for thinking through the building envelope in particular, exempting envelope additions and some of the technology that you want to see in the buildings from setbacks can be really helpful. Is that then when you're adding to the envelope for an existing building, you're not then cutting into the living space that's already planned for. You're able to preserve that space and allow for more flexibility within that space as well for the renter and the person who's actually living there to be able to arrange that space how they want to and have a little bit more agency over it, as opposed to like cutting into that space.
Okay, thank you. And if I could, just one more question quickly.
Yeah.
In like housing complexes, is there a way to compost? I know that sounds, that's not maybe out of your jurisdiction when people have very small or no yards, and obviously they don't want rodents and animals coming close. Is there anything the city can do or the management have you heard of anything where they could have one big compost space or anything else? Or
yeah, it's not my perfect area of expertise. I would say that I don't know if Jillian is in this section, Jillian Wilson-Martin from Natick, but she's done a really cool curbside composting pilot with part of Natick. And I know that there are other communities that have looked at how to have that small like unit or house-based composting. But we also, yeah, and Heidi Stucker at MAPC is a great resource for thinking through composting as well.
Great. I see a question from Charles in the chat. And Charles, let me know if there's others to add. Are there examples of climate overlays or anything like that in place?
That's a great question. So we have examples of transit-oriented development overlays already, which is one of the other overlays in this chapter. We don't have overlays in Massachusetts yet that are as aggressive and as direct as the measures that as the overlays that we've laid out as examples for this chapter. So we're trying to really lay out how far can we really go with zoning and how creative can we be, and then allow the flexibility to scale back a little bit if that's not something that's achievable.
If I can follow up for a second.
Yeah.
Charles. I mean, my concern here is we'd love to have our own town building code and require all this stuff, but we know we can't do that. And we don't really feel like being the ones who have to spend all the money on lawyers to fight with people about whether this is going to pass. So I was looking for examples of useful zoning things that have passed Attorney General muster, things in towns that have actually happened in Massachusetts that we can do beyond permitting solar, which is, easy. And of course we'll do that. But if you're going to have HERS requirements, or if you're going to have emissions requirements, or you have to be electric requirements that someone has done in a town, we just rather not go first.
Yeah,
I think that's something
No,
that as
going
we
first is
find it, will circulate to the group too. We're really excited to
Yeah.
be able to stay in touch on these issues. I saw there's a question from Elizabeth Faxon, as how can we tie this to our MVP action grant program? And then I'm hoping we'll be able to squeeze one more question in at the end, because we are very close to time and I really want to respect everyone's time today. So Nicole, MVP action grants.
Maybe.
So yeah, it's not my perfect area of expertise, but I have seen communities include some zoning measures into their MVP action plans, and I think it can be a great overlap, especially because a lot of the zoning measures, because of the difficulty that we've been talking about of making sure that we're not overlapping with building code, one of the easier ways to make sure that we're encouraging those net zero changes that we want to see is to pair those with climate adaptation changes that we want to see as well. So there's a really great opportunity to overlap our climate mitigation goals and our climate adaptation strategies in one place. So we can look to zoning where we're addressing floodplain issues and raising the first floor of buildings, for example, or taking other measures like that in at the same time that we're enacting these other support for clean energy technology. So you can absolutely add this to your MVP action plan, and I think it's a really good fit and a good way to set one framework and make sure that you're putting a lot of different pieces into zoning at the same time.
We just got our 1 minute warning. Any other questions? I did see from Amy a question about the Watertown solar. Nicole, that's not something that's in your bucket, right?
Let me see.
I'll follow up separately. Tracy has her
Okay.
hand up and I want to get to that question.
Yeah.
The question is gas emissions is a big part of pollution. Transit authority transportation is is it green enough, and how are there programs that will make it cost effective to bring to our cities?
That's a great question, and I think that Meg is great at answering, in particular, some strategies and some programs that municipalities can take advantage of in terms of implementing electric vehicle charging stations and some additional infrastructure for that. Meg, I don't know if you heard the question, but it was about transportation and some strategies that we can use for that, and maybe in relation to zoning or not. I'm not sure, Tracy.
Well, it's public transportation, really, I guess.
Oh, okay.
So there would be less cars. And it's not so much zoning, but.
That's okay.
Sorry, was it on?
Why don't I give Meg a few seconds to think? I just want to sort of close out our presentation, and then you guys can chat a little bit more, because this is a great conversation. I just really want to say thank you so much to the Clean Energy team at MAPC for presenting, to Metro West and Magic today, to all of you for coming and listening and learning together. I'm so excited for the opportunities to continue this work together. I know in Metro West, we have a lot of conversations about the great work happening in our communities, and it's really exciting to sort of grow this out and see what's happening in Magic. And I know in talking with Lizzie, it's a similar feeling for Magic. So great partnership. We will be sending out this slide deck so that you have it. And I ask of you, please to fill out the survey that we're going to be sending along with it. To get your feedback, because we were going to do it today on the slide, but we really want to be able to get you back out to all of the great work that you're doing in your community. We will also be making available a video of these of our conversation today. So if you have committee members or other folks in your community that would benefit from hearing some of this, please share it. And then also the Clean Energy team has made themselves available for continued conversations. So get your questions to me or to Lizzie, and we will pass them along to the appropriate Clean Energy staff. Thank you all again so much for participating today. And we are gonna keep this line open for a few more minutes if folks have questions that they wanna discuss together. And so I will stop there and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome. So maybe now that I'm fully here,
Yes.
Tracy, if you wouldn't mind repeating the question that you had for Nicole.
Oh, so the last question was, how are there programs that will make it cost effective for us to bring public transportation to our cities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the one that comes to mind is that's probably most applicable to public transit would be the Volkswagen settlement funds that were the first round were made available through Mass DEP. And a lot of those were funneled out through their electric vehicle incentive program, but they also last March had an open solicitation for those larger projects that would fund electrification of things like transit buses. And I can't remember off the top of my head which RTAs, regional transit authorities, got funding across the state, but several of them did. And I know a couple of communities, including Concord, I believe, got funds to electrify some school buses as well. There will be more rounds of funding through Mass DEP. When the timing for those hasn't been announced yet, but that's something to definitely keep an eye on for those. And I think especially when it comes to public transit, starting conversations with the MBTA and MassDOT around that, since a lot of that will be kind of in their decision-making power. So in terms of what we put in the playbook for municipalities to do around public transit and increasing and advancing improved service in your community, but also advancing electrification, is to get more engaged and do more advocacy with the MBTA and MassDOT to make sure that those priorities are being heard in those planning processes too.
Okay, thank you. They're my new best friends.
Any other last minute questions or thoughts as people are here?
Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming. We'll officially end the meeting at this point.
Really
So when will the next one be?
That's a good question. Hopefully in our next fiscal year work plan.
Yeah. Did I hear a voice about to say something? Maybe. Okay.
Just another voice chipping in saying great job.
Oh, thanks, Matt. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, if there are particular topics that folks are excited to dig into more in a future session, please let us know. We'll definitely include that as one of the survey thoughts, but yeah, keep learning together.
Okay, I'm gonna end the meeting for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.